Welcome back to PCTR's Generous Justice Study. I'm Robbie Itterberg, one of the pastors. And if you're new to a group this week, welcome. And if you came back, I guess you must have found the first week valuable for you. And even at the same time, may have found it thought-provoking or even challenging, which I think is part of what God has for all of us on this journey together. Well, as we noted last time, we are going to compress this week 2 chapters into one discussion. And so we're talking today about chapters 3 and 4, those chapters entitled, What Did Jesus Say About Justice and Your Neighbor? Both chapters 3 and 4 are essentially Jesus reinforcing how much justice matters. Even though we live on this side of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, justice was still a primary part of Jesus's mission, especially that aspect of justice that is generously providing for and caring for the needs of the vulnerable. We can be tempted to turn a blind eye to the plight and the suffering of those around us and offer a word of hope and encouragement for the next life, but nothing for the here and now. But Jesus holds all of that together. He holds out hope for eternity beyond this life, yes, but also for hope for the day in, day out plight of people suffering today. The early church clearly understood that there was hope for today. Maybe they understood it a little more intuitively than we do as the American church. We live in such relative peace and comfort and security. We live without the threat of a state power persecuting us and hunting us down, whereas the early church, they understood that. They lived in the shadow of that kind of persecution and injustice and uncertainty. And so they knew there was a need for hope because they had a need for hope for the here and now, for this life. And in Acts chapter 4, we're told that there were no poor among them. I read that and I go, really? Is it really possible? And not only is it possible, it's actually God's intention. It's always been God's intention for his people. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 15, which Keller does, in verse 4, it says, there should be no poor among you. There should be no poor among you. That's God's plan. And they knew it. The early church took that incredibly seriously. But I think if I'm honest, admittedly, I probably take Deuteronomy 15:11 more seriously. Because in that verse it says, the poor you will have with you always. I think it can be tempting to use that truth as a way to justify looking away when we see those who are suffering, those who are poor among us, as if, well, it's just true. We're going to have them with us always, so I guess I don't need to do anything about it. But Jesus really strikes right at the heart over and over again of our temptation or even desire to minimize the demands that God puts on us, these demands to seek justice. In chapter 4, Keller talks about Jesus' famous parable, the Good Samaritan. And the context for that story that Jesus told was a conversation with an expert in the law. And he was trying to justify himself before Jesus. And he asked, who is my neighbor? In other words, it was kind of like he was asking, well, if we take care of our own, if we look after those who are on the inside, is that enough? Have we done enough? Jesus responds to his minimizing, justifying question with the incredible and shocking story of the Good Samaritan, the one who was the racial and religious outsider who comes to the aid and the rescue of the victimized Jewish man. The Samaritan cleans his wounds, puts him on his donkey, takes him to an inn to safety, and promises to pay anything necessary, any debts accrued, to provide for his healing. And at the end of the story, Jesus flips the entire question on its head. The expert had asked, who is my neighbor? But instead, Jesus asks, who acted like a neighbor to this man who fell victim to these robbers? Even the expert in the law had to acknowledge that Jesus had blown open his understanding of justice and who was worthy of generous care. Not just those on the inside, but everyone of every race, every religion, every gender, every socioeconomic class. With the gospel, Edwards is addressing issues of the heart, which is also what Keller is talking about when he says a lack of justice is a sign that the worshipers' hearts are not right with God at all, that their prayers and all their religious observance are just filled with self and pride. The temptation as we think about doing justice is to just make ourselves do it, just because we feel guilty about not doing it, figure out how we're going to get it done. But that kind of approach doesn't actually address our heart. It might last for a little bit, have a bit of effort, fits and starts, or it might lead us to a place where we just feel self-righteous or feel good about ourselves when we're doing it and feel ashamed when we're not. So how can we be people who truly live justly? This is where Keller, I think, so helpfully points to what he calls the Great Samaritan, not just the Good Samaritan. He notes how Jesus in the parable makes the hero a Samaritan, even as he's telling the story to a Jewish audience. What that would have meant was the hearers of that story would have had to put themselves in the story as the victim and ask themselves, if I was in that place, would I want a Samaritan to help me? Even though not only do I not deserve help from them, I may even disdain them, they would have reason to hate me, to trample me, or at very least to disregard my suffering. The reality is we're all that man. Maybe not physically dying in the road, but all of us dying in our sin, in desperate need for someone to come and rescue us. And then enters Jesus. He comes into our dangerous world. He sees us in our suffering and has compassion on us. He's moved to care for us, give us aid, to rescue us, and ultimately to save us, not just at the risk of his life, but at the cost of his life, to pay the debt that we could never pay, the debt that would ultimately make us well. And when we have been loved like that, then maybe we can turn and love our neighbors, whoever they may be, and no matter what it may cost us.